What would you do if a uniform gave you power over another human being? In the summer of 1971, a group of ordinary college students agreed to take part in a simple psychology study. None of them were violent. None of them were criminals. Within days, some became cruel, others broke down, and the experiment had to be stopped. What happened inside a fake prison at Stanford University still raises uncomfortable questions about human nature today. For decades, psychologists debated a troubling question. Is human behavior shaped more by who we are or by the situations we are placed in? Acts of cruelty were often explained as the result of flawed individuals, while obedience was seen as a personal choice. But by the late 1960s, this explanation no longer felt sufficient. Across the United States, trust in institutions was collapsing. Authority was questioned openly. Prisons, once viewed as tools of order, were increasingly associated with abuse, riots, and dehumanization. These were not isolated incidents, yet the blame was almost always placed on individual guards or inmates, not on the systems that governed them. Philip Zimbardo, a social psychologist at Stanford University, believed this focus missed something fundamental. He argued that powerful situations could overwhelm personal values, quietly reshaping behavior without people realizing it was happening. His interest was not in extreme personalities, but in ordinary people placed inside rigid structures of power and submission. To explore this idea, Zimbardo proposed a study that would simulate prison life as realistically as possible within a university setting. The goal was observation, not instruction. Participants would not be told how to behave. They would be given roles and allowed to respond naturally to the environment. If behavior changed, the situation itself would be the most likely cause. Recruitment began with a small newspaper advertisement offering pay for a psychological study of prison life. Many young men applied. After interviews and psychological screening, 24 were selected. They were emotionally stable, mentally healthy, and unremarkable in every important way. None had criminal records. None showed signs of violent tendencies. Their ordinariness was essential. Roles were assigned randomly. Some became guards. Others became prisoners. This randomness was meant to remove personality as an explanation for what followed. The prison was built in the basement of Stanford University's psychology building. Former classrooms were converted into cells and corridors. A small closet became a space for isolation. The environment was intentionally stripped of comfort and individuality. Prisoners would wear identical smocks marked only with numbers. Guards would wear uniforms, mirrored sunglasses, and carry batons. The sunglasses prevented eye contact, removing an important human connection. From the beginning, the setting encouraged distance, anonymity, and authority. Before the experiment began, Zimbardo assumed the role of prison superintendent. At the time, it seemed like a practical decision to maintain realism. What was not yet clear was how quickly this choice would blur the line between observer and participant. Everything appeared controlled. The participants understood the rules. The environment was ready. But once the roles were activated, the situation itself would begin to shape behavior in ways no one fully anticipated. The experiment began quietly, without confrontation or drama. There was no prison yard, no watchtowers, no history behind the walls. Everything was constructed from ordinary university space. In the basement of Stanford University's psychology building, classrooms were cleared and reshaped. Doors were reinforced. Bars were installed. Hallways became corridors. What had once been a place of lectures and exams was transformed into a controlled environment meant to feel institutional, impersonal, and confining. The goal was realism, not spectacle. Every detail was chosen to remove comfort and familiarity. The space was intentionally stripped of anything that suggested normal student life. Fluorescent lights replaced softer lighting. Windows were blocked. Sound echoed differently underground, making footsteps and voices feel sharper and more exposed. Even before anyone entered, the environment itself communicated authority. The prison was small, but that was part of its power. There was nowhere to escape the setting. Cells were narrow and bare, each designed to hold several prisoners. There were no personal decorations, no clocks, no mirrors. Time would be dictated externally. Identity would be reduced to function. Nearby, a small storage closet was designated for solitary confinement. It was not large enough to lie down comfortably. It was never described as punishment, only as a procedural tool, but its presence carried weight. The guards' area was separate, reinforcing division. Uniforms were prepared in advance. Prisoners would wear identical smocks, loose and shapeless, marked only by numbers. The numbers mattered. Names would not be used. Guards would wear khaki uniforms, boots, and mirrored sunglasses. The sunglasses were not meant to intimidate directly. They were meant to block eye contact, removing subtle human cues like empathy, hesitation, or doubt. Without eyes, expressions disappeared. Authority became faceless. Rules were written simply and posted clearly. Prisoners were told they could leave the study, but only through a formal process that resembled parole. This detail mattered. It introduced uncertainty. Leaving was possible, but not immediate and not entirely under their control. Zimbardo and his team believed these constraints would help maintain realism without forcing behavior. The expectation was that participants would remember this was an experiment. That knowledge, it was assumed, would act as a safeguard. The prison did not look violent. It looked orderly, clean, controlled. That was the point. The danger was not meant to come from chaos, but from structure. As final checks were made, nothing appeared unusual. The design seemed modest, even restrained. No one anticipated how quickly people would adapt to it. The environment waited, neutral and silent, ready to receive those who would soon inhabit it. The assignment of roles was meant to be the most neutral part of the experiment. Randomness was the safeguard. By removing choice, the researchers believed they were removing bias. Each participant had an equal chance of becoming a guard or a prisoner. No one was selected based on personality, background, or preference. On paper, this ensured fairness. In practice, it marked the moment when ordinary identities began to dissolve. Those assigned to be prisoners were not informed in advance. Instead, their experience began unexpectedly. Local police cooperated by carrying out real arrests at the participants' homes. They were handcuffed, searched, and read their rights in front of neighbors and bystanders. The arrests were brief, but they introduced a sudden loss of control. For many, it was the first time authority had been imposed so directly. The participants knew they had volunteered for a study, yet the experience felt uncomfortably real. After being processed at a police station, the prisoners were blindfolded and transported to the mock prison. Upon arrival, they were stripped, deloused, and issued their uniforms. Names were replaced with numbers. Personal belongings were taken away. These procedures were framed as routine, not punitive. Still, they created a sharp psychological break from normal life. Guards, by contrast, arrived knowing their role in advance. They were given uniforms, instructions, and a general mandate to maintain order. They were told not to use physical violence, but they were given broad discretion in how they enforced rules. There were no scripts, no rehearsals, no examples of acceptable or unacceptable behavior beyond basic constraints. This lack of detail was intentional. The researchers wanted behavior to emerge naturally. From the first moments, the imbalance was clear. Prisoners were disoriented and uncertain. Guards were prepared, organized, and unified by appearance. The mirrored sunglasses further removed personal identity. Guards could see without being seen. Prisoners could not read expressions or intentions. Even without aggression, authority was present. The experiment had not yet produced cruelty or resistance. There were no confrontations, but something subtle had already shifted. The roles were no longer theoretical. They had been enacted in the real world through arrests, uniforms, and procedures. The participants had stepped into positions that carried meaning far beyond the laboratory. From this point forward, the situation itself would begin to guide behavior, quietly and persistently, regardless of individual intentions. Order emerged quickly, not through force, but through routine. Once the experiment was underway, the guards began establishing control in small, seemingly reasonable ways. They organized counts, enforced schedules, and corrected minor rule violations. None of this appeared extreme. In fact, much of it resembled ordinary institutional procedure. Prisoners were required to line up, respond to their numbers, and follow instructions without delay. These early actions were framed as necessary for maintaining order. At first, the prisoners complied. They were unsure how far the rules extended and assumed cooperation would make the experience easier. But compliance itself reinforced the structure. Each count, each command, strengthened the authority of the guards and reduced the prisoners' sense of autonomy. The guards, for their part, began to grow more confident. Wearing uniforms and sunglasses, they felt less like individuals and more like representatives of a role. Decisions became easier when responsibility felt shared. No single guard felt fully accountable. Authority was collective. This diffusion of responsibility allowed behavior to escalate subtly. Small punishments were introduced for perceived disobedience. Extra counts, loss of privileges, sleep disruptions. None of these actions were violent. They were procedural. That was what made them effective. They were framed as consequences, not cruelty. Prisoners began to test limits, sometimes through humor or mild defiance. These acts were rarely coordinated, but they were noticed. Guards responded by tightening control, increasing surveillance, and emphasizing discipline. The tone shifted. What had started as role-playing now felt like enforcement. Prisoners were no longer treated as students participating in a study, but as subjects to be managed. Over time, the guards' language changed. They referred to prisoners by their numbers. Commands replaced requests. Interactions became shorter and more impersonal. Eye contact was rare. The sunglasses remained in place, reinforcing emotional distance. Some guards appeared uncomfortable with their authority, but they rarely challenged the group's behavior. Others embraced the role more fully, finding that order came more easily when rules were enforced without hesitation. The prisoners began to react differently as well. Some became passive, withdrawing and complying automatically. Others showed signs of stress and frustration. The imbalance of power was no longer theoretical. It was embedded in daily routines. Importantly, none of this was directed by the researchers. The escalation came from the structure itself. Authority had taken root, not through explicit instruction, but through repetition and reinforcement. What was unfolding did not look dramatic. It looked organized, and that made it harder to recognize how far the situation had already moved from its original intent. As the days passed, the effects of the environment became more visible, especially among the prisoners. The routines that had once felt temporary began to feel permanent. Waking hours were structured by counts and commands. Silence and compliance were rewarded. Hesitation was noticed. Gradually, the prisoner's sense of individual identity began to erode. The use of numbers instead of names was no longer just a rule. It became the primary way they understood themselves within the space. Conversations between prisoners shifted as well. They spoke less about the outside world and more about the immediate rules and expectations of the prison. Time felt distorted. Without clocks or windows, days blurred together. Some prisoners began to show signs of emotional withdrawal. They followed instructions automatically, responding without reflection. Others struggled visibly. Frustration surfaced through small acts of resistance or emotional outbursts. But these moments were brief and often met with increased control. The guards interpreted these reactions as discipline problems rather than distress. This interpretation mattered. Once behavior was framed as misbehavior, stronger measures seemed justified. Loss of privileges became more frequent. Tasks were assigned not for productivity, but for compliance. The environment rewarded obedience and punished deviation, even when deviation was harmless. The prisoners' physical needs were met. They were fed and housed. But psychologically, they were increasingly constrained. Personal boundaries disappeared. Privacy was minimal. Even sleep was interrupted. Over time, some prisoners began to internalize their role completely. They stopped questioning instructions and accepted the structure as inevitable. One prisoner experienced a breakdown so severe that he had to be released early. His distress was initially interpreted as weakness rather than a response to the situation. This reaction revealed how deeply the roles had taken hold. Observers, including the guards and researchers, struggled to see the behavior as a consequence of the environment rather than individual failure. What was most striking was how quickly these changes occurred. The experiment was designed to last 2 weeks. Within days, the psychological strain was already intense. The prison did not rely on physical force. Its power came from routine, isolation, and the steady removal of personal agency. Identity was not taken all at once. It was worn down gradually, through repetition. By this point, the participants were no longer simply acting their roles. For many, the roles had become their reality. As pressure continued to build inside the simulated prison, a critical shift occurred not among the prisoners or the guards, but among those observing the experiment. The researchers had intended to remain detached, objective, and analytical. Yet as the days passed, detachment became increasingly difficult. Or, more accurately, it quietly disappeared. Philip Zimbardo was no longer just a researcher watching behavior unfold. In his role as prison superintendent, he became part of the system he had created. This dual role altered how events were interpreted. Incidents that might have raised concern were reframed as expected challenges of prison management. Complaints were heard, but often minimized. Emotional distress was noted, but explained away as temporary. The language of observation slowly gave way to the language of administration. When prisoners showed signs of anxiety, confusion, or breakdown, these reactions were frequently attributed to personal weakness rather than situational stress. The possibility that the environment itself was causing harm became harder to acknowledge. This blindness was not intentional. It emerged gradually, reinforced by the same structures shaping everyone else's behavior. The guards had authority, the prisoners had lost autonomy, and the observers, positioned above both groups, began to prioritize the continuation of the experiment over the well-being of the participants. Procedures replaced judgment. Rules replaced empathy. One moment in particular exposed this shift. A former prisoner returned to the prison to express concern about the conditions and the mental state of those still inside. Instead of triggering alarm, his warnings were interpreted as interference. The system defended itself. It was easier to maintain the framework than to question it. Ethical oversight, which today would be mandatory, was informal and limited. There was no external review board actively monitoring events as they unfolded. Responsibility was concentrated among a small group, all of whom were immersed in the same environment. As a result, warning signs accumulated without decisive action. The experiment was no longer simply observing the effects of power. It was demonstrating how easily authority can suppress moral awareness, even among those trained to study human behavior. What made this stage especially troubling was how normal it appeared. There were no dramatic confrontations, no clear breaking point that demanded immediate intervention. Instead, concern faded into routine. The extraordinary became ordinary. The system continued to function, and that functionality masked the harm being done. By this stage, the experiment was no longer under full control. It was moving forward on its own momentum, sustained by roles, expectations, and a shared commitment to the structure itself. The question was no longer how the participants would behave. It was whether anyone would recognize that the experiment had already gone too far. The end of the experiment did not come from a planned conclusion or a predefined stopping rule. It came from an outside perspective that had not been absorbed into the system. When psychologist Christina Maslach visited the prison, she was not there as a guard, a prisoner, or a supervisor. She was there as an observer, and what she saw disturbed her immediately. The conditions, the behavior, and the emotional state of the prisoners felt wrong. What struck her most was not any single act, but the overall atmosphere. People were suffering, and no one inside the system seemed to fully acknowledge it. Maslach challenged Zimbardo directly, questioning how such treatment could be justified in the name of research. Her reaction broke through the normalization that had settled over the experiment. For the first time, the situation was reframed not as data collection, but as harm. This confrontation forced a reassessment. When the events were viewed from outside the roles and routines, the ethical problems became undeniable. The experiment was halted after only 6 days, far earlier than the planned 2 weeks. The shutdown was abrupt. Guards were told to stop. Prisoners were released. The structure that had felt so solid moments before dissolved quickly. Yet the psychological effects did not disappear with the uniforms. Many participants struggled to understand their own behavior. Guards expressed surprise and discomfort at how easily they had adopted authoritarian roles. Prisoners described feelings of shame, confusion, and lingering stress. Post-experiment interviews revealed a common theme. Most participants had not realized how deeply they were changing while it was happening. The roles had felt natural, even inevitable, in the moment. This realization was perhaps the most unsettling outcome. The experiment had not revealed hidden monsters or heroic resistance. It had shown how ordinary people, placed in a powerful structure, could drift into behavior that conflicted with their values. The study quickly became one of the most discussed and criticized experiments in psychology. Ethical standards were re-examined. New rules were introduced to protect participants in future research. Yet the questions raised by the experiment extended far beyond academic policy. The Stanford Prison Experiment forced a confrontation with an uncomfortable truth. Systems of power do not require cruelty to function. They only require compliance. And once that compliance becomes routine, the line between acceptable behavior and moral failure can fade without anyone noticing it disappear. Long after the basement prison was dismantled, its implications continued to resonate. The Stanford Prison Experiment did not end when the doors were opened and the participants returned to their daily lives. It became a reference point for understanding how systems shape behavior and how easily responsibility can be displaced onto roles and rules. In the years that followed, the study was cited in discussions about prisons, military conduct, corporate culture, and political power. It offered a framework for explaining how ordinary individuals can participate in harmful systems without malicious intent. At the same time, the experiment itself came under intense scrutiny. Critics questioned its methodology, its ethics, and the extent to which behavior had been influenced by subtle cues from the researchers. Some argued that the guards were playing a role they believed was expected of them. Others pointed to the lack of safeguards and oversight. These criticisms did not erase the experiment's impact, but they complicated its interpretation. Rather than offering simple answers, the study became a case study in ambiguity. What remained clear was the speed at which behavior changed. The participants were not coerced. They were not threatened. Yet within days, patterns of dominance and submission emerged. This raised difficult questions about personal responsibility. If behavior is shaped so strongly by context, where does accountability begin and end? The experiment suggested that moral failure is rarely sudden or dramatic. More often, it unfolds gradually, through small decisions made within accepted structures. This insight remains relevant. Modern institutions still rely on hierarchy, obedience, and routine. The Stanford Prison Experiment serves as a reminder that these elements, while necessary for organization, carry inherent risks. Awareness alone is not enough. Without active reflection and ethical checks, systems can drift toward harm even when populated by well-intentioned people. The most enduring lesson of the experiment may not be about prisons at all. It may be about vigilance, about the need to question roles, challenge authority, and recognize when structure begins to override empathy. The basement at Stanford is quiet now, but the questions raised there have not been resolved. They continue to echo wherever power is exercised and wherever ordinary people are asked to carry it out.